Good. As we've talked about, most English translations of this chapter like to use euphemisms rather than being literal, which I think you lose some of the severity of the judgment when you don't actually hear the words that God's saying, but you hear them soften it a little bit. You know, nudge, wink, wink, you're supposed to know what's going on. Yeah. So you missed last week. All right, so we can summarize that. And chapter 16. Yeah, you missed the beginning of it. So this was the birth of Jerusalem, and if you remember, she came from nothing. She had been abandoned. It's all allegory, if you like. We talked about this, right? Isn't it? It's not an analogy. It's not a metaphor. It's not. Actually, we said it's not allegory. We said it was more like a parable, where you can't necessarily line everything up with actual events. Sometimes it's explicit, other times it's not. Linda, make sure you grab a handout on your way. Get some coffee and donuts, please. All right, so this is all a parable to teach Israel, or Jerusalem in particular, both who God had made her and what he had given her, and then how her unbelief and her rebellion against that, by using this parable of this girl grown into a woman, and then who becomes a harlot. It's not the only place in the Bible that talks this way. It's not the only time in Ezekiel we're going to encounter it. It's going to come up again, I think, in chapter 23. It's basically the book of Hosea, minor prophet. Jeremiah uses the same language too. And then Revelation does as well from Babylon. So the idea, I probably wrote something on here about this, but I don't know where it is. The idea that idolatry is linked to adultery is all over in the Old Testament, especially after the exiles, or during the exiles. And it's also then the context for what you heard from St. Paul in today's epistle, from Romans 5. Did you catch that? It seemed kind of weird once you look at it. There's a sandwich in the text. You don't have it in front of you. Okay, because you have it up on the screen, right? All right, so Romans 5. How's that? Hey. All right, so what verse did we start on? What's your bulletin say? Ephesians 5. Nobody corrected me. All right, there we go. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and service or sacrifice to God. All right, so that's gospel language, right? You've been made children of God you can import baptism into that, which came in the previous chapters. And walk in love as Christ loved us, right? So he gave himself for us as a fragrant and sacrifice. Okay. And then it's like, it seems to change subject, right? Well then, but sexual immorality and all purity and covetousness must not be named among you, even among the saints. Filthiness, foolish talking, crude joking. If you're going to try to avoid today, even as we describe things that are pretty crude. All right? Which are out of place, and instead let everything be, or let there be thanksgiving. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral, there it is again, or impure. So we've had, this is now the third expression about some kind of specifically sexual, immorality, or here, and impurity. Before that was filthiness, filthy talk. Or who is covetous, that is an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of God, of Christ and of God. Right? Don't be partakers with them. And then it comes back to the good news, right? For one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of light is found in all that is good, right, and true. Try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. So you note that for Paul there, sexual immorality it's one of the more severe forms of unbelief and idolatry. Because you're making an idol out of physicality, I guess, or your body. Or is it the other's body?
Big deal.
Yeah, it's a big deal in body. And of course, it's probably the thing you're told not to say anything about. What are the three things you don't talk about at family gatherings?
Sex.
Yeah, and politics and religion. Right. And then two of those, the Bible has quite a bit to say about sex and its purpose. And but you can't talk about those two things. So then you never actually deal with the actual way that today, in particular, I think sexual sin is probably one of the more obvious rebellions against God's word. Right?
No coincidence.
Not a coincidence, no. Also that you're not supposed to talk about it and you're supposed to be
Right, it's
permissive.
not a coincidence either.
Yeah, don't talk about it. Don't ask, don't tell. Oh, that was the military.
Yeah, it does.
Wow. So it's even in the New Testament is my point, this theme, which as hard as it's going to be to hear, now we're back to Hebrews. Let's not go to Hebrews. Let's go to Ezekiel 16. As hard as this is to hear, I think it's necessary. And it's actually the background then for both what we read in Paul and also what you'll see in Revelation someday as you study that. All right? Because in Revelation, it's reversed. All right, so we have, I don't know. Oh, it's doing a little hovering thing. That's fine. Did you ever want to know what the Hebrew word is? There it is. All right, good. So remember, she's of foreign birth, right? Of the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite, and your mother a Hittite, and she smelt of elderberries. Some of you might know that reference. All right, at least one of you does. Good.
You guys don't get it?
No, I said it last week, and nobody got it.
Oh.
From the Holy Grail. Yeah, the Thompson Frenchman. Yeah.
English
So,
make it.
okay, now you got it.
Sorry.
Notice that in her birth, I'm not doing this for you. You notice that in her birth, she was born, they didn't cut her cord, she didn't get washed, she didn't get swaddled, and then the whole bit with the salt, which is they use like as an antiseptic before you would swaddle them. Right? So she's literally abandoned. And we talked about in the ancient world, this was a practice you would do. If you didn't want a child, you didn't abort the child, you just delivered it and then left it out in the wilderness to die. They thought that was more humane. As long as far enough away you can't go, you get exposed. Yeah, so.
What section is this? I'm sorry.
This is Ezekiel 16. See your sheet? You got notes? Oh, last week's sheet is also back there. If you weren't here last week, you can grab that. I'm reviewing for the people who weren't here. Like you. Nobody wanted her. She was cast out. She was abhorred. Right? And then the Lord, Yahweh, came by and saw her wallowing in her blood. Right? This is going to come back today. So she's laying there in her birth blood. Naked. Nobody cared for her. And again, it's a parable, but, God called Israel brought Jerusalem out of nothing. I mean, Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldeans. There wasn't no Israel until God made an Israel. Right? Then we talked about her growing up, and you already have some of the more beautiful aspects of her developing, right? Breasts are formed, hair had grown, we talked about which hair that is, and yet you were still naked and bare. And then Yahweh comes by and sees her, and she was at the age of love, in other words, past puberty, I guess, right? And then we talked about spreading the garment over her, just like Noah's son did for him, the one that wasn't cursed. Not Ham, but Shem, I think, right? Yeah. That was scandalous too. So this public nakedness is scandalous. This will come back, right? Because then she ends up actually embracing this.
That's related to the fall too, isn't it?
Yeah, so when you talk about being exposed or naked before God, there is that spiritual, this is presented physically, but there's also that spiritual element. Adam and Eve, after they sinned, they hid in the garden from God, right? We know how effective that was at hiding. Also, they made fig leaves into garments, which I don't know if you've ever tried to do that, but they don't cover too well. Right? Yeah, so they were, even though they had attempted to cover themselves and to hide, they were exposed and naked before God too. Right? But, he anthropomorphically, if you like, in like human language, he said, "Where are you?" He's walking about looking for them. Right?
But I really thought God didn't know where they were.
Or that they could hide their sin from him. Right? So this is what his word of law does, is it lays this open. It's like we try to bandage up the wound, and he's like, no, that's not going to work. It actually needs to be opened, and healing needs to be applied to it. You can't just cover it over. Right? And that's what sin is like. It's like a wound, too.
I was listening to a sermon on the way here, and it was
it good?
It's on
Okay.
88.1.
All right, keep going.
It's on 88.1, so I just, no, gosh, I can't remember.
All right.
But anyway, I would just pick out things. But anyway, I thought you had a good point. He was talking about how our culture, we have such guilt feelings. And that's because, sometimes we are feeling guilty over things that maybe we shouldn't, but it's because we don't address the things that we actually are guilty about And our culture wants to say, oh, if we just get rid of those guilty feelings, we won't have any guilt. But it's because we're not addressing our sin.
The actual guilt.
Right.
Right? Because guilt comes from a declaration of a word, right? Like from a judge. Right? They say, you are guilty. Now, that feeling of guilt is a symptom, right? Sometimes it's a false symptom, though, too. Because you can have false guilt or false shame.
Right.
You can feel guilty about something you shouldn't feel guilty about, or ashamed about something you shouldn't be ashamed of. There's that too, right? But yes, you're right. There's you can't just deal with symptoms. I can't make you feel better. That isn't my job. You might end up feeling better after you hear your guilt actually taken care of. That is absolved in the blood of Jesus. Right. And so it's kind of like chasing a ghost to say, well, I went to church today and I felt better, or I didn't feel better afterwards, or it didn't lift me up, or I didn't feel the Spirit move. It's like, well, that's your feelings, which may or may not respond to the Word of God, but that's not up to you either. That's up to the Holy Spirit too. Right? So I don't think it's a trustworthy indicator. I don't think the Bible would have you trust your feelings. Who says trust your feelings? Oh, that's Star Wars. Right? Trust your feelings, but right? Feel it moving within you. It's Gnostic nonsense. Okay. Don't watch movies for theology, by the way. Oh, actually, bad theology. You can do it for that. I clothed you. So notice what he does. He washes her cloth. He anoints her with oil. He clothes her like a queen, right? With embroidered cloth, with fine linen, silk, ornaments, bracelets, chain around her neck. She's got all the bling. I put a ring in your nose, not like a cow, but a beautiful one. And earrings in your ears, and a beautiful crown on your head. There's the definite queen language, right?
Wow.
Yeah. This is all what God did for her. She was abandoned and worthless, and He made her worthful. I don't know, worthy, I guess. Yeah, full of. You grew exceedingly beautiful and advanced to royalty, and I would suggest this comes actually by the bestowing of the gifts of Yahweh. That her beauty is a result of His gifts. This happens. Some people, people have like permanent frown on their face. Have you seen people like that?
What do we call that? RS.
RBF.
Yeah, all these are euphemisms for young people. Right, but then it's probably, a lot of times it's environmental. I don't know if it's physiological. I think it's environmental. Like, you grow up in a kind of an environment that's, I guess for lack of a better word, more toxic or more negative, and you end up expressing that in your body, like with your shoulders and everything. Watch the body language expert people on YouTube. It's really interesting because they can see all this stuff. Yeah, they can tell you what's going on. Right,
God's saying, be beautiful, wear jewelry.
He's making her beautiful. Yeah, because she had nothing. She was an abandoned infant out in the wilderness who can do nothing for herself. Right? But He caused her to grow and to give her gifts. And then her renown went forth among the nations because of your beauty, for it is perfect through the splendor that I bestowed on you, declares the Lord. So there it is. That's the point I was just asserting. He makes Himself, right? All right. That's where we left it last week, which was nice and pleasant. But then what does she do with the gifts that God has given? All right. She uses them, just like you heard in the sermon today, for her own benefit and not for the glory of God. All right. So we need to read. I don't know how far we want to go. We'll see. I gave you more notes than we probably have time for, which is okay. Because I know what we'll do at least one more week on this chapter anyway. So let's read. This is ESV up on the screen, English Standard Version. If you've got other Bibles, you can follow along in yours. Who would like to read? Is it big enough? It should be a little bigger than it was with the tablet.
It's bigger.
Okay. But they'll be really big once the display's here. You want me to read?
I'll read.
Okay, thanks.
If I can't read it all, please.
Yeah.
But you trusted in your beauty and played the Lord because of your renown and lavished your warning on any passerby. Your beauty became His. You took some of your garments and made for yourself colorful shrines, and on them played the Lord. The like has never been, nor ever shall be. You also took your beautiful jewels of my gold and of my silver, which I have given you, and made for yourself images of men, and with them played the Lord. And you took your embroidered garments to cover them, and set my oil and my incense before them.
All right, I'm going to scroll a little bit for you. There you go.
Also my bread that I gave you, I fed you with fine flour and oil and honey. You set before them for a pleasing aroma. And so it was, declares the Lord God. And you took your sons and your daughters, whom you have born to me, and these you sacrificed to them to be devoured. Were your whorings too small in matter, but you slaughtered my children and delivered them up as an offering by fire to them? And in all your abominations and your whorings, you did not remember the days of your youth, when you were naked and wallowing in your blood.
Yep. We reviewed just a minute ago.
Any
Yeah. And you never thought you'd say whore and whoring so many times.
I just gonna say, you handled them well.
I always joke. When I was on Big Ridge, so I was a new preacher, and it landed to me to preach on January 1st, which is the feast of the circumcision in the name of Jesus. So I just went into some relatively graphic detail about what was going on with the circumcision. I'm not even a pastor yet, so whatever. Nothing to lose. And I had somebody come up to me after church. He's like, Pastor, I've never heard anyone say penis so many times. It was great. Which we don't talk about in school. I always say, ask your parents. Right? Because like you said, no crew talking, no filter talking. That's what I used to apparently in service. Anyway. All right, so look at the introduction here on your sheet. I'm going to read that for you, and we'll dig into it a little bit. That Jerusalem, quote, played the whore, summarizes the rest of the chapter until its eschatological reversal at the end. Meaning eschatological, big word we've defined before, means end times. Just last days. All right, so we'll see everything reversed in the last days, which John talks about in his Revelation. By the way, play the whore, whoring, whore occurs 22 times in this chapter. So, all the various forms of it. This language refers not only to literal sexual sins, but as we were talking about before, also spiritual unions with false gods. So it's kind of a double. It's a double entendre. Yeah, it was right before you got here. It's not a metaphor and analogy; it's literal. But to follow after false gods is to play the whore with them. So he likens it to sexual sin. Yeah, and the other way around. Sexual sin is likened to idolatry as well. So it works both directions.
And that's in the same.
Yeah. So a double entendre, if you like French. Who's it French?
It's actually really fun.
Oh, yeah, I know. I'm not going to pronounce it like I'm from America.
You want to be French.
From the Midwest. For Jerusalem, that was Texas, anyway. For Jerusalem, the newly found beauty and fame were intoxicating. She lost all sense of history, perspective, and propriety in her inebriations, which is like wrong with her beauty. The temporal and ephemeral, so temporary and fleeting, you might say, replaced the eternal. The gift displaced the giver. This is what sin always does. It takes the gifts of God and uses them against faith and against God rather than for. Trusting in beauty is likened to the primeval hubris of Satan. I like using big words this week, apparently. Seizing equality with God. The chapter is not an indictment of the world, so to speak, but of the people of God, the church. All right, so that's one of the things I wanted to caution you from, is saying, well, we look around, we see sexual sin all around us. That's always been true for the whole history of the church. From Adam and Eve all the way to the current, is that the world has been full of sexual idolatry. So that's not new. Whether it was religious or just pagan, secular, or whatever, it doesn't matter. We had this naive notion probably in the 50s. We were just better at hiding it, I think. That's my assertion. I'm too young, so I don't know. At least my whole lifetime, sexual permissiveness has been the norm in this world. At least since the 60s, for sure, right? We even had a thing called the sexual revolution, right? All right. So that's something like there was no golden age, we'll put it that way. But the distinction here is between how do God's people behave in the midst of that. And that does change. Sometimes more fidelity, sometimes less. Right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So the indictment's against God's people specifically. Yes, the world is indicted as well for their immorality, right? But that's because they're unbelievers. The problem with Jerusalem or Israel, Jerusalem globally, Israel larger, is that they're acting like their neighbors. Actually, they participate in these things with their neighbors, as we'll see in a minute. All right. Whew. All right, so we're going to scroll back. Let's look at the text in detail then. So, oh yeah, you trusted in your beauty. There it is. Right? So she just gets all caught up in herself. This is self-worship. This is the Instagram people. Right? They even use filters to make themselves look more beautiful. But, supposedly. Right? They worship, I mean, literally, like, I have to see, like, how many likes, how many shares, how many...
No.
Yeah, right? They saw that, adorable or beautiful or whatever, shot I put up there.
I heard another phrase to describe that. Selfie enthusiast.
Selfie? Selfie, like taking a selfie.
For the selfie enthusiast.
The selfie enthusiast. Yeah, oh, that's good. I like that. Yeah. And I don't like it, but it's right. Oh, by the way, this is true. We were talking about beauty and gifts of God, but it's also true for things like technology. Right? They can be used for good or they can be used for ill. They're not necessarily. Beauty is not a negative, but beauty can be used. I should have made more coffee today. That's beautiful.
Sorry, man. I'm sorry,
We're gonna
man.
leave it down for you.
No, it's okay. It's good.
Did you get enough, man?
I didn't think anybody would come.
Yeah.
It's snow. Whoa, stay home. All right. Let's see, what are we talking about? So she played the whore because of her renown and lavished her whorings on any passerby, and then exchanged the beauty and gave it to them. Right? So not very discriminating either. So this is like, I think I put somewhere on the sheet that she's like she's a nymphomaniac. Yeah, it's at the end of it's at the bottom of the sheet. She is a picture of a nymphomaniac out of control and on public display. Yeah. I know, but I'm not trying to be crude or filthy, and it's not.
We're reading the Bible, Pastor, I know.
It's not meant to make you laugh, it's meant to make you ashamed.
Well, I'm laughing because it's just so outrageous.
Right, and I think we talked about this with language last week. It's like, we don't want to avoid language that is outrageous, because God is trying to describe for her.
He's doing a really good job.
To say, you don't even understand what you've done, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's take this more seriously. Yeah, that's right. I'm not saying to you, I'm saying to them. All right. So maybe, where do I want to go? 16, 17, right? You took some of your garments and made yourself colorful shrines, and on them played the whore, the like has never been, nor ever shall be. All right. So there, maybe have in mind the golden calf, I suggest, where they took the gifts that God had given them in Egypt. Remember, He caused the Egyptians to give them the gold and silver. Right? Get out of here, take our gold and silver. Right? So they come out wealthy, and then they collect all the gold and they fashion it into an idol to represent God, if you want to put the best construction on it. But then, if you know, Moses notes their behavior. They're worshiping like pagans. So they're dancing, they're singing, and they're offering sacrifices to it. All right. So that has. But what Ezekiel's saying here is, when he's preaching, is that what they're doing now is even worse than the golden calf, I would suggest. By the way, I don't know how offensive I want to get today. Baal in particular was portrayed as a bull, so that idea of being a golden calf is not, it's a Canaanite god. They just took the Canaanite god, and then Aaron tries to whitewash it by calling it the Lord, an icon of the Lord. Remember the Exodus story? He's like, oh, we're going to have a feast to the Lord, Yahweh, while worshiping a Canaanite god, effectively. By the way, next to the Canaanite god, they set up pillars, which are not inadvertent. You have a fertility god and there's a pillar. You can imagine what that's representing. Yeah, they're thousands. I wrote it, actually. It's there. Yep. By the way, our country also has the same gods as a nation. We say we have separation of church and state. No, that's not right. The Christian church has been excised. Washington, D.C. is full of pagan icons, in particular. We have a goddess, who the French gave us. But after the French gave us the goddess, then we needed a male one. So what's the male?
The George?
Yeah. No, not George.
Oh, Washington?
Oh yeah, no, it is George. You're right. It is called that. Yeah, the Washington Monument. Yeah. And then if you look at like Lincoln and other ones, there's all sorts of weird Roman, Greek, pagan icons all over those.
And then the Capitol building, and then
Yeah. Right, and I pointed this out to you before. when we talked about after January 6th a few years ago, I pointed that out, right? It's like the language of the Speaker of the House saying that this is a hallowed hall and a sacred space, and you're like, gross. Totally gross. We don't worship you. And if we did worship you, you are terrible gods, ugly idols. Anyway. I mean, not yet, truly American idols, I suppose. All right, good so far? Yeah. So we're not, like I said in the sermon, okay, your heart is a throne, and if God is not set up in the throne, some other God will be, or gods. There's no way around it. And so a country divorced from worship of Christ is going to worship some other God, or gods. Right? And probably a pantheon. It's going to be a multitude of gods. So, there you go. There's a contemporary setting. But we are, of course, not Jerusalem, and we're not Israel. So, that doesn't mean we're not idolaters. The light has never been nor shall be. Okay, then she takes beautiful jewels of my gold and my silver. So whose gold and silver are they? Hers? No, they're on loan to her from God. That's right. She's a steward of a sort. Which I have given to you. Well, you're mine too. So if you have silver and gold for me, then it's still mine because you're mine, right? And made for yourself images of men, and with them play the harp. So you can imagine this is actually statues, and then she takes the garments. This is the picture you're supposed to have. Making statues to worship, and then putting on them the garments that he had given to her. So exchanging her glory and giving that glory to the men, the idol men. By the way, also, we didn't mention this, but it's worth doing. In every pagan cult, there's temple prostitution. Right? Including the Washington cult. So.
Ew.
No, it's true.
No. Stop, Pastor.
I'm just saying.
No. They're on display on TV all the time.
Yeah, they do play on TV all the time. Yeah, they're all compromised. Because that's part and parcel of being part of Washington. I mean, I don't know if they're all compromised. A lot of them are. We know a lot of them are. Right? Because they get caught up in that, because it's leverage and it's also idolatry.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I liked in your sermon how you made the point that we think in our culture that we're just fighting this evil, but it's actually Satan.
Yep.
Like people just don't want to put him.
Yeah, it's personal.
Right.
It's it's personal between God and the devil. One thing I didn't say in the sermon, but I did probably intend to insert at some point, maybe more than once. It's not an equal fight. It was at the end. Christ has won the battle. Right? But the devil is, he's persistent, and he still wants to tear down as many as he can in the process of the mop-up, So the demons still roam about, and are still trying to make a mess of things, even though the victory's won. And he doesn't want you to trust that the victory's been won. Right? Because we're in that in-between time. We're waiting for Christ to return and to take us into the kingdom of Christ. So there's not usual, I'm importing some ideas here, as I say on the notes. The Bible doesn't really go into great detail describing the pagan rituals. He's got a lot of detail about what God commands the people to do. But he doesn't describe why. Why don't you tell the kids about all the things that they're not supposed to do?
Give them too many ideas.
Because then you give them all the ideas, right? This is why you don't have sex ed curriculum in school. Because you don't need to give them any ideas. Mm-hmm. And of course, as we know, especially public curriculum, that's a little, too informative, we might say. Let's see what else is in there. We have beautiful jewels, and you took them for reverence, and covered them, set my oil and my incense before them. All right, now if you remember, there's probably a note here if I hover, but I don't know. That was 23. It comes up again in chapter 23. Oil and incense. Oil wasn't explicitly dedicated to God. He used oil for all sorts of things, cleansing more than anything, for soap effectively. But incense, according to Leviticus, is explicitly, frankincense in particular, only to be used in the ritual acts that God has appointed. So you burn incense for anything else, that you got from the head shop or whatever, try to cover up the smell that you don't want your parents to smell. That's forbidden, according to Leviticus. They would only burn incense. And the idea there is that sweet-smelling aroma, which we heard from Paul today, that Christ offered himself as a sweet-smelling aroma. That's the only aroma God wants to smell. He doesn't want to smell any of your sacrifices, because they all smell terrible. He wants to smell the sun. And so frankincense literally then is meant to in an iconic graphic way or substitutionary way, be the sweet-smelling sacrifice, to represent the sweet-smelling sacrifice of Christ. If you smell sacred frankincense, it's really sweet. Right? If you get the cheap stuff, it'll burn your eyes and all that kind of stuff. But if you get the good stuff, it's really, it actually opens up your sinuses instead of closes them. At least for me. All right. Good so far? That was the easy stuff. Ready for the hard stuff? Yeah, bread.
Think it better go, Pastor.
What?
Think it better go.
Oh, yeah. By the way, bread too. Bread, oil, and honey. Honey was forbidden in Yahweh worship, and like according to Leviticus. I gave you the citation. Leviticus 2, verse 11. You never use honey in the temple. It's a wild sweetener, right?
Okay.
At least it was for them. They didn't cultivate it. I don't think cultivation of bees came until, I don't remember who started doing that. But Israel did. You hear about wild honey all over. The cultivated honey came later. And again, bread. There's an appropriate use for bread, then there's an inappropriate use for bread. Right? So the bread that's offered is showbread, which was appointed in the temple. Again, for those of you who haven't been with us this whole time, Ezekiel was trained as a priest, but he never got to be one. Because he was taken into exile, what did we say, 590, so we have to go back and look at the old sheets, 592 BC, something like that. About 5 or 10 years before the last collapse of Jerusalem. Yeah, 595, 597. Somebody will find it. All right, so he was trained as a priest, so there's lots of priestly language in his prophecies, even though he never actually got to be one. But he has all the aptitude and training. So he makes all sorts of connections to proper worship being compared here. So you set before them, that is the idols, the men idols, the garment that you clothe with your garments, a pleasing aroma. And so it was, declares the Lord God. Right? So now, incense, oil, bread are set before these male idols, which is a metaphor within the parable for her immorality with all the men that passed by, which are pictures of the nations. So it's the way that broadly speaking, we can say that Israel joined in union with foreign nations all around her. And it never goes well. Whether through marriage, like with king and queen, you think Ahab, and that's Israel, North Israel, but fine. Ahab and Jezebel, remember Jezebel? Yeah, she was a pleasant character. She brought all sorts of nice ideas in, right? Solomon, his foreign wives brought in all idolatry, including the thing we're going to look at next, right? So there's literal union there for marriage, but also just like treaties and other things. And you took your sons and your daughters, whom you had born to me, because remember, she's the bride, God was the husband. So the children that he gives her, you sacrifice them to be devoured by fire. But the devouring by fire is a picture in Canaanite worship and ancient Near East worship of actually the God eating that. So the God eats the child, but it's through fire. Does that make sense? Yeah. And you think, oh, child sacrifice. Whoa. It's so common in the ancient world and to the modern day that it just takes on different forms periodically. But it was so common that, like I said, Solomon had set up outside of, maybe Solomon, or at least Ahaz. The first record I found was in Ahaz. I think I listed it here. Someone sacrificing man. 2 Kings 23. Ahaz had those altars, and they were right outside of Jerusalem, in the valley by the brook Kidron, which became a garbage dump by the time of Jesus. But before the exile, that's where they did the child sacrifice to Molech, which was a kind of an honorific title for Baal, where they would sacrifice children to them.
Are these all basically the devil, Molech, and all the rest of Baal?
Well, it's an idol, so it's of the devil.
Okay.
Yeah. But to sacrifice to an idol is to sacrifice to the demonic, I suppose, or whatever is not God.
Who needs baby blood? I'm going to ask you that.
But here's the point. I mean, there is something fundamentally true about what they're doing. So we don't want to make light of this. And because God actually institutes as part of the Levitical sacrificial rite, is that you saw this with the presentation of Jesus. right? He has to be presented at 40 days in the temple and redeemed. Because if you don't redeem him, he belongs to God. Now, God doesn't take him and kill him. God uses him in service of the temple. Most parents redeem their child back. With the turtle dove or pigeon, in case of Mary and Joseph, that's the one that poor people use. Or if you're wealthy, you do like a bull. Right? You see the bull in the case of which prophet? Who was the first? Eli? Who's Hannah's son? Samuel. Right? Samuel? Yeah. So Hannah has been praying for a child, keeps going to the temple, praying for a child. God gives her a child, and on the second year, she actually presents him. She agrees with Eli, that's right, that she'll bring him back the next year. And they offer the bull sacrifice to redeem him, but instead she commits him, as she had promised, to service in the temple as a prophet, as ends up being a prophet. Yeah. So the firstborn son belongs to the Lord according to the Levitical law. There is that idea, and that's a kind of sacrifice, but not for death, or not for a hungry God who needs, baby. Yeah, it's creepy, right? But I mentioned this last week, and it's worth mentioning again. I saw this. Don't go on TikTok, but I don't go on TikTok. But somebody sent me a link, and it was a woman who was suggesting, she's probably in her 20s. She was suggesting that we needed to have pagan rituals attached to women when they have abortions.
Oh, I saw that.
Did you? Yeah.
Set up an altar.
Yeah, so she has this altar set up because there's loss of blood and all sorts. So my point with this is the greatest sacrifice you can make is your own child. And you talk to parents of people who sent their sons off to war, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, great sacrifice for your country. Now, that's not a pagan ritualistic sacrifice, hopefully, although it might be for some parents. If they really worship the country as their idol, that doesn't mean it's not a sacrifice; it's not hard, but it's still, it could be religious, and you have to be careful about that. We're not trying to make atonement for our nation or something like that by sacrificing children. They have that idea. Everybody around them is doing it. So much so that when you hear the story of Abraham and God commanding him to sacrifice Isaac, neither Abraham nor Isaac has any problem with it. They both, when Abraham explains to him, they just agree to do it. Well, why would they agree to do this? It was before Exodus, before Levitical, right? This is what they do.
So it's just rampant religion.
Right, and what's interesting is God prevents him from doing it.
Yeah, that is interesting.
And says, no, we're going to cut this off, and I'm going to provide...
Why are they going to do that?
No, not cool at all. We're going to provide the ram as the substitute, right? Which he does.
Interesting. We were just reading about that the other day. That's one of the big ones.
So read out of context.
Yeah.
This is a creepy
really
story.
Bizarre story.
Right. But in context, everybody sacrifices.
Okay, then you're like, well, of course we know. Yeah.
I don't know. I still can't fathom it, personally.
Yeah, right?
Because I've never even thought that would ever be acceptable. Right? But you could sacrifice children for a career, right?
Sure.
Born them in the womb so that you can pursue your career as a woman, right? Or as a man, too. I don't want to take care of the kids, right? You could abandon them, or you could just say, let's just kill them.
Go to public school.
Well, I did not say that.
What is the bigger part of this?
Well, especially today, because quite a few people couldn't make it, All right. So when you think about this bit, you say, well, that can't possibly be what he's talking about. No, they actually had a valley. It's called Hinnon. And in Hebrew, that's Gay is the name for valley, so it's Gay Hinnon, which in Greek gets translated as Gehenna, which you've heard that word before, Gehenna, as a metaphor for Bible, or for hell, excuse me, in the Bible for hell, right? But it literally means the valley of fire. I mean, it's the valley where the children were being consumed by fire, right? By the way, then when you look at classic art, this is somewhere on your sheet. When you look at classic art, you'll almost always see it this way: that the saints of God are clothed in white garments, and the damned are naked and exposed and in fire. This is where it's all coming from. It's from these pictures. You're like, well, that seems a little bit... I had some people complain about the bulletin cover, which is not your fault. Every year. It's
really bad.
We just need to get rid of this bulletin cover. But it's actually what he said happened. The kids love it, so that's why I keep doing it. It's like, oh, can I call her that? I can call her that. Yeah, that's the reality of demonic possession. Right? So we think, maybe that's another way to apply the sermon, is that we think that like this talk of demonic is all metaphorical, not actual, physical. There's actually a demon coming out of his mouth. That's why it pushes the point a little bit.
Your sermon also brought to mind to me screw tape letters.
It did, intentionally.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, I think I almost directly quoted Sweden, yeah.
Almost, you didn't, but
What's that?
Oh, by C.S. Lewis. Very controversial book. He writes, it's a dialogue between an older demon and a younger demon. And actually very helpful for spiritual practice and spiritual discipline.
it's very good.
Because he's
The screw tape letters.
Yeah, he's quite
Screw tape?
insightful.
Screw tape.
Screw tape, yeah.
Letters. C.S. Lewis.
All right. So that it's the dialogue between these demons. The reason it's controversial is like, well, don't tell us how the demons work, because then you're letting them in. People were very pious about it. But it actually works to highlight all of the many different strategies that the Scripture reveals that the demonic or Satan works. More than I could do in the sermon today. Long. Especially deals with contemporary context, although it's dated now. If you want a modern retelling of it, Pastor Riley wrote one. It's called the Wither Tongue Emails. Yeah, nice book. I mean, he's my friend, so of course it's a nice book. But
Is it really then?
it's amazing.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, and you see the connection that she, because of her behavior, she's putting herself back in the same position she was in. Wallowing in her blood, naked, laying on, It's like you gave up everything that I gave you. This is, if you want a practical application for us, this would be to say, well, God has made you his child, he brought you through the waters of baptism, and then he's promised you all these gifts that he delivers to you in the divine service, and then you're like, I'm spiritual, not religious. So I don't need any of the churchy stuff. Because he saved me. I was like, yes, he saved you, but then he also gives you all these gifts to keep you in the faith. So don't neglect those, right? Including actually fellow Christians to be with you, to encourage you. We had, of course, had a lot of conversations about that with the lockdown. Which, in hindsight, I think a lot of us would do things a little bit differently. But got blindsided. All right, we'll do one more fun part. It won't take us very long. And after all your wickedness, woe to you, declares the Lord God, in case you forgot, as I've said. You built yourself a vaunted chamber, that could be metaphorical, and made yourself a lofty place in every square. So she set herself up as God, as an idol. She had man idols, now she's got herself as idols everywhere. Right? Worship me, worship me. At the head of every street you built your lofty place, and made your beauty an abomination, offering yourself to every passerby and multiplying your whoredoms. By the way, maybe if I roll over this, it's going to tell you the literal. You can read it. No? How about here? Oh, yes, there we go.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Which word is that?
literal.
Yeah, they said, offering yourself. No, that's not what it means. All right. You read that?
Inside that.
Now you got a
I
mental
can
image.
reassure myself. Yeah, this is.
You also play the whore with the Egyptians, your lustful neighbors, which is also a metaphor. All right, that's a euphemism there, but let's not. That one, they don't give me a literal. Anyway. Yeah, I'll just spare you. Multiplying your whoring to provoke me to anger. Actually, if I rolled over, what did it say? Yeah, I just did this now. Okay. Behold, therefore, I stretched out my hand against you and diminished your allotted portion, and delivered you to the greed of your enemies. All right, so after the Egyptians, the daughters of the Philistines, who were ashamed of your lewd behavior. How's that for an insult? Even the Philistines thought you were acting inappropriately. The Philistines, if you know, they were originally Phoenicians. I didn't know that until a while ago. Because they settled all along the Mediterranean there. So these are Phoenicians that sailed across the sea, ancient Greeks, and then they ended up being. But they're giants, which is weird. Yeah. Don't know much more about them. You also played the whore with the Assyrians. This is just an order of operation here. Because you were not satisfied. Yes, you played the whore with them, and still you were not satisfied. Then you multiply your whoring also with the trading land of Chaldea. That's Babylon, by the way. And even then you were not satisfied. Right? So that's order of operation. I gave you some citations for that. Where is it? Turn the page. It's on the back side of the page. Yes, off the back side of the page. Egypt, you can read some of the examples there from Genesis 15, Exodus 12. That would be, I think, 1 Kings, not 2nd. Good. Tell you which kings. With the Philistines, they make all sorts of treaties with them. I mean, they were supposed to wipe them out because of their idolatry. And then the Assyrians, they make treaties, and then that Assyrians like, hey, weakness, and they take over, and they conquer the northern kingdom. And then Babylon takes over the southern kingdom in 2 Kings. But there's always a deal before that. We'll marry you, or we'll do something, we'll make this work. And then they just consume you. Right. Look at the bottom of page 1. And like I said, we'll end on this. We'll come to the dominatrix next time.
Oh, great.
That's what it says. Jerusalem's harlotry becomes more brazen, and Yahweh's exasperation increases. Her behavior becomes increasingly more flagrantly obscene. Oh, I didn't give you another literal. That one comes next week. Good. She is a picture of an nymphomaniac out of control and on public display. Her sexual partners are from the neighboring nations. Political and economic entanglements with foreign nations were part and parcel of the whoredom. By the way, the ancient Near East knows nothing of a church-state separation. And I would argue we don't either. We say we do. It just means we just don't want Christians in the state. That's what they're saying. We don't want Christian people exercising according to their faith political office. Right? Remember when Mitt Romney ran? He was a Mormon. And they were still like, well, how's your Mormonism going to affect what you do as a senator? He's like, it's not going to affect it. That's my private religion. And it doesn't, actually. So, that's another whole story. Every nation fostered worship of its gods for protection and prosperity. The ordering of the nations roughly follows in holy alliances. So, to join with them, and they would often, the covenant or the promise or the agreement would be commemorated with worship of gods. That's what you would do. You go to church together. This is what, do you know the Prussian Union? You heard this? I can't remember the king. It was Frederick, right? And then his wife was Reformed. He was Lutheran. And then they're like, well, but we're going to join the Lutherans and the Protestants together by marrying each other and then going to church together. Yeah. And forcing everybody else to as well, even though they don't actually agree with each other. And then the Saxon immigrants, one of the groups that founded the Missouri Synod, fled that. Because they're like, we can't worship with the Reformed because we don't believe the same thing. It's not saying they're not Christians, it's just like we don't, especially on the sacrament of the altar, they don't believe that it's Christ's body, blood, and the Lord's Supper. Well, they do it, it's spiritually present. They don't believe it's physically present. So we don't actually agree. So we can't worship together, even though we're not like denying them salvation. It's just like, we have to keep the distinction. And maybe someday they'll change their mind, maybe someday they'll reveal to us that we're wrong. But for now, there's a distinction. And to act as if we're the same church, because everything Lutheran had to be compromised. That's ultimately what ended up happening. Like if you join with somebody else who believes differently, they're going to win, almost always. Especially when it comes to Lutherans, because, I don't know, they were weak. I don't know, actually, why that happens. The Reformed said you have to use red wine. The Reformed said you can only have so many candles. The Reformed said, just like Rome had done to the Lutherans before, then the Reformed did too. Said, you have to take the bread and break it. And the Lutherans like, no. Yes, I know he says he took the bread and broke it, but they were saying you have to break it because we say you have to. And I'm like, well, you can't tell us what to do. I'm like, yes, we can. That was the result of that union. And Lutherans are like, because you're telling us we have to do it, then we have to disobey. And then they made their life miserable, and so they said, we'll go to America. Long history, short there. Because we want to go somewhere where they're not telling us that we have to do these things that God has not commanded or forbidden. Right? That's the reason maybe why we come off this week. Because there's plenty of things that we say, like you don't have to fast, you can fast. And then Rome says you have to fast. Then we argue about it forever. You know? And so maybe it is a weaker position, but it's like, God's word doesn't say it, so why are we trying to say this?
That seems like a stronger position. Because we rest solely on God's word.
Yeah, but when it comes, well, at least what I've seen, people marrying like a non-Lutheran, they just go over to whatever the spouse is doing. I don't know, just practically speaking, because especially if you have like a thing like papal authority, and your priest says, and your Lutheran pastor is like, nah, God actually hasn't said so. Do what you think is best according to your faith, and it's always the priest says wins because it's assertive.
It's weird. For me, it wouldn't. So.
I know. Right, but you can be defiant. Just when they tell you have to do something that God hasn't commanded, then you can say.
Because if Jesus says, go another mile, and someone asks you to carry something, we with the faith too.
Yeah.
Catholic spouse says, do this, and you don't believe you should, but I'll do it.
Yeah, and it may be an immaterial thing, but it seems like if you forfeit the immaterial, you end up forfeiting the material.
Yeah.
If you major in the minors, I don't know. All right, so try to give you some gospel so you can go with something pleasant. Look at the end of the sheet. We'll come back to this next week. I wanted to leave you with something positive. Don't be negative before that. Note the anthropopathic language, another big word. That means God is described as having emotions like ours. That's all that means. Right? So it pains him, he grieves, he changes his mind, that kind of language. Yahweh will only be satisfied once he has completely executed judgment on the woman. Right? But that's his alien work, by the way, which I said above. Ultimately, and here's the key, the full severity of his wrath against Jerusalem, Israel, against us, falls upon the sinless Christ on the cross. In that way, Christ's vicarious sufferings will make full satisfaction for humanity's sins. Which Ezekiel hints at the very end.
Ooh, intriguing.
Yeah, so you have to hold off on that. It'll come back. But because this cycle keeps repeating. He redeems her, he saves her, and then she goes back to her whoring. And then he redeems her and saves her, and keeps going back to it over and over. Meaning, somebody has to take her place and suffer the full penalty for it and absolve her and wash her clean once and for all. Because she keeps returning back to her old ways. Like a dog to its vomit, as Paul says.
And that's for us too, isn't everyone, right?
Yeah, no, it's true. Well, and this is the life of the Christian. If you want another positive, it's dying to sin, rising to new life in Christ, in your baptism. So, in the morning you say, keep me from sin. And in the evening you say, forgive me for my sin. In the morning you say, keep me from sin. And then forgive me my sin. And it's like, oh, well, who's going to save me from this body of death? And the answer is, according to Paul, Romans, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. Right? So then, the whole point of all that testing and trial and refining is that your faith would be in Christ and Him alone. Not in your own beauty or your garments or your gold or whatever nonsense you have. Or even her promiscuity, actually. It seems like she trusts in that too. She does come off that way. And yet to the world she is, well, no, she's also kind of gross too. She ends up being gross too. Kim Kardashian. There's your
right?
with an OnlyFans account. Yeah. That's effectively what it is. For the whole world to see. Yeah. Just give me $5. Alright. That's a good way to end it. Lord be with you all. I'm sorry, we have to do one more chapter on this. Or one more week on this chapter.
Sorry.
No, and I think the vividness of it is just... You can handle it here in Bible study because, we have time to kind of work through it. If I just preached that way in the pulpit, I think we might have some people that wouldn't do that. That sermon was very offensive. I'm not going to. Have fun. Mike's got men's thing.